Well, good morning and Happy New Year, everybody. So good to see you, and great to have a wonderful crowd here this morning to begin the new year. And for many of you, I know that you have been viewing from at home for a very long time. Many of you are still tuning in today. We're glad, however, you are attending worship, and we're glad that you are with us. I'm going to be reading to you from the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, and I'll be reading from near the end of the book in the 61st chapter. So here's Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 4. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. They will be called the oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, to display his glory. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall rise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So I wanted to start a new sermon series for the new year, obviously trying to get things started off on the right foot. And I've been thinking about this for, many weeks or months now, about what I wanted to do in January of 2021. This is a year that feels different in lots of ways. It's a new year that we have been really craving for a very, very long time. Every year when you get to January, it feels like, okay, this is a fresh start again, new calendar. We set New Year's resolutions. We want to do some things differently. We set some goals for ourselves. All that seems to happen every January 1st. But this one, for all of the reasons that 2020 brought us, feels like a time when many of us have really been hungry for that fresh start again. Give us a hard stop on the old, give us a clean beginning on the new. And if you're like me, that just has felt like a really desirable thing, something that I've been wanting for a long time. I know you have too. And even that feeling that you get when you have a clean start, you know, when you do all of your chores and you now have a clean space to live in, when you crack open the cover on a brand new notebook or journal and it's just a blank slate before you, you have that opportunity, a fresh canvas to paint on. Whatever it is, we like those fresh starts. And this year, we are hungry for that perhaps more than we ever have been in our whole lives. At least many of you, I'm sure, are feeling that way. But we have had this cultural, this societal, I guess it's a global thought that somehow when we turned the page and entered into 2021, that things were going to be different. But of course, we're already a few days into the new year, and you have probably found out that much like celebrating a birthday, you're probably not a whole lot different today than you were on December 31st. We turned the page on the calendar, and for those of you who are here on Christmas Eve, that was part of the sermon that night, was just the idea that it's not changing the date that changes our lives. It's valuing things differently. It's reorganizing our priorities, and most of all, as people of faith, putting a renewed sense of hope and joy in our faith, in our belief in Jesus Christ and his redemption for us. So I want to start things off, at least in terms of what we're talking about with the sermons and time in worship, with a sermon series that I'm simply calling Life is Good, because I want us to emphasize all of the things that are good and right. Now, I don't want to sweep under the rug some of the challenges and the difficulties. We'll talk about those too. But I want to first and foremost set things off and say, let's talk about what is good. Let's talk about what is joyful. And most of all, let us talk again and again and again about where we find our source of hope and comfort in terms of the days ahead. So, Life is Good is what we're calling this, and I want to talk to you a little bit about how we oftentimes start off just in the wrong place. See, this is something that we sometimes kick ourselves for. We feel like, why am I so negative? Why do I focus on the bad news? Why do I focus on the hardships? And the truth of the matter is that you need to cut yourself a little slack, because we are hardwired, biologically predisposed to doing this. Okay, we have something that in social sciences we call a negativity bias. And again, a negativity bias is just that. We are biased towards the things that are negative. And we have done that because it has ensured our survival throughout thousands and thousands of years. As one person I was listening to give a talk about this the other day posed the thought, he said, 10,000, 100,000 years ago on the plains of Africa, if you missed out on some good news, you probably went on with your day. If, however, you failed to hear about some bad news, you may not live to see the rest of that day, right? When things present themselves in terms of bad news or in terms of danger or in terms of warnings to us, we better pay attention. And so that has guaranteed our survival, or at least contributed greatly to it throughout the generations, throughout the millennia. And the same is true for us today. We do things that instinctively help us to be careful, to be cautious, to be on the lookout, and be on guard so that we are not surprised by something. But what that has done, it has meant that our brain tends to favor, or at least give priority, to the things that are bad, that are warnings, that are negative around us. And so all kinds of people have picked up on this, and we've known more and more about this in recent years. And so in terms of the advertising that we receive, or in terms of the headlines or the leading news stories, we know what those are because people understand that people will follow those things or pay closer attention to them if they start out by leading with something negative. This is something that we should pay attention to, that we should try to avoid, that we need. And so stories in the news are often presented as negative because it draws us in. And again, that is biological. That is something that has happened throughout the millennia. That is something that is part of who we are. So if you find yourself thinking that there's all kinds of negative news in the media, you are probably right. Now, I'm not here to drag the media. I'm just saying to you, this is just a part of how our brains work. And we have to understand that because it's part of understanding that negativity bias, which will help us understand then how we should confront that or how we should work against that and what tools are at our disposal to work against that. Interesting research in just the way that the information is presented. You can look at the same thing and present it in two different ways, and one way you will take as favorable and one you will take as negative. This is research that has come out of California at Davis. And one of the things that they did was they gathered a group of people, and they presented them with a pretend headline. And the headline was this: 40% of people have found work after the recession. And they said, so how do you receive that information? So that sounds pretty good. I mean, that's people who are going back to work that have been unemployed for a while. That's awesome. They said, okay, and then they presented the story differently later on. They said, what about this headline? 60% of people still without work after the recession. Now, you've heard the same news story. 40% have work, 60% out of work. But depending on how you pose the story or the headline, we receive that information differently. So again, our minds go to the negative first. But there's all kinds of information out there that suggests that things are actually improving and not getting worse. The problem is, because of our built-in negativity bias, we're inclined to think that as we compound and pile on these news stories, that things are actually getting much worse and worse and worse as time goes by, when in reality, things seem to be getting better and better and better. So one of the things that we know is that the world has probably never been more peaceful than it is right now. Now, we hear about conflicts, we hear about fighting, we hear about threats of wars, or as the Bible says, wars and rumors of wars, and that's there, but not like it used to be. Let me tell you about some other interesting statistics, and these are from a social scientist named Hans Rosling. Hans Rosling died just a couple of years ago, but he had the unique and distinctive title of being the professor of international health for the country of Sweden. And he was very fond of presenting information that was actually quite positive, but people assumed that it was going to be negative. Some of his favorite statistics over recent years were some of the following. He said, "Did you know that the number of people who die in natural disasters annually has gone down 80% since the early 1900s? The number of people who died by natural disasters in the year 1900 was around 500,000. 500,000 people would die of natural disasters a year, 121 years ago. Today, that number is like a little less than 100,000 annually, globally. Now, that's really something. Now, of course, we can credit all kinds of advances in technologies like weather radar and things like that, so we know about things like hurricanes, and we can forecast when tornadoes are going to come, even when the conditions are right for tsunamis and so forth. And so all of that has contributed to take that number a lot lower. But looking at the news, you'd probably think the opposite. Like, this is happening more and more. This is worse and worse. But actually, fewer lives are lost every single year. Another thing that he points out is that the average 30-year-old male on the planet has received 8 years of formal education, on average. 8 years of formal education. So you assume that you start somewhere around the age of 5, like we do in the U.S. with kindergarten, and then that gets them to, age 14 or so. And then he asks the audience, so how many of you think that you could guess about how many years of formal education the average female gets? Well, the answer is 7. Now, it's not as good as the male, and neither one of those numbers are particularly impressive on a global scale. But the fact is, because of our negativity bias, we are probably more likely to say 2, 3, 4 maybe. But in reality, it's much closer to the males, which is a good thing. Another thing that he talks about is that the number of people who are living globally in dire poverty, extreme poverty, has been nearly cut in half in the last 20 years. The number of people living in dire, extreme poverty has been cut in half in the last 20 years. These are things to celebrate. They're signs, they're measurements that show that things are getting better. We're not done. We're not out of the woods. It's not okay for us to say, oh, well, we can just sit back and let things continue to get better. No, we've still got to work for them. But the point is that things are starting to get better. Another person who does a lot of work in this field, he's a physician, an engineer, and an entrepreneur whose name some of you may be familiar with, Peter Diamandis. He says that one of the interesting things that's occurred particularly recently is the fruition of Moore's Law. Some of you may be familiar with Moore's Law, but the idea is that it's named after the president of the Intel Corporation, who said that in the world of computer chips, microchips would get twice as powerful on average every 2 years, but at half the price. So as that compounded, what we know is that we now have this, which is more powerful than what you can find at the Space and Rocket Center that they were using in the 60s in Huntsville, right? And that it has become incredibly inexpensive. And what that has meant is that more and more people now have technology in their hands, literally at their fingertips, and individuals in faraway and remote places now have access to more information than entire governments had 30 years ago, which is a pretty phenomenal thing. So one of the things that Diamandis says is he says this is the democratization of technology. He says because this has become so ubiquitous around the world and everybody has access to this, now all of a sudden everybody has the ability to contribute to the greater good. And so he said what we are seeing is that there are people who are able to contribute something and put it on the web or share it with the world, and collectively now we have things that we can do that many people have never been able to do before because we've been looking at them in such small groups. Like it was just this little think tank at this elite university who was doing this work before. Now everybody has a chance to contribute. And even as we look at something as painful, as awful, and as much of a difficult time as this coronavirus pandemic has been, one of the things that he cites in all of this is he said, never before in human history has the world put all of their best and brightest and all their efforts into a single cause. I mean, yes, we can look at things in our own country like how we responded to the Great Depression or how we mobilized for World War II and things like that. But this is the whole world working together cooperatively on a project and making huge strides. And though it's not exactly what anybody would in this room would say was on their timetable of preference, it's still happening faster than it ever has before. And it's leading to other breakthroughs. Interesting research has come out of some of the work that's been done on the coronavirus vaccine, and it's actually found that we are going to make advancements in terms of combating HIV because of some of the things that we have learned in trying to respond to the coronavirus. So fascinating that sometimes there's a silver lining or other things are good because collectively we are working as a global team on a specific project. And this is likely to get better and better and better. So, my point in all of this, of course, is that here is some hard data. Here is some technology and science and medical information that would suggest that things are getting better, that life is actually pretty good as a human being in 2021, despite where our minds probably jump to initially. Now, let me say this. I realize that for many people, all of the data in the world doesn't take away the personal struggle or pain that many people are feeling right now. I appreciate the fact that the average girl on the planet is going to get 7 years of formal education, and that's very close to their male contemporaries. But that doesn't necessarily hurt my heart as I grieve the death of a loved one. I realize that it's a pretty good thing to say that there might be advances in vaccine technology going forward, but that doesn't necessarily help me right now as I'm thinking about my situation with unemployment. You get what I'm saying. And so there are some things that we will never be able to fully point to research, statistics, or really nice examples that heal the pain that we are personally feeling. That data doesn't take away the suffering and the pain of isolation. Depression is not cured by recognizing that there are less people dying of natural disasters. Some things can only be addressed by matters of faith. And one of the things that we turn to today is the hope that we find actually in maybe what seems like an unlikely source, which is in the book of Isaiah. Now, the book of Isaiah is an interesting book because it's a very long book. Those of you who have read through it probably recognize that there's a lot in there. I mean, some of it reads like poetry, like some of the Psalms. Some of it reads like historical material. Other times it feels very prophetic. And so it's kind of an interesting book. It's fascinating, kind of very mysterious in a lot of ways. Part of what has led to the complexity of this book is that most scholars for at least the past 150-ish years have believed that this is actually a collection of 3 books combined into one. So we call them 1st and 2nd and 3rd Isaiah. By the time we get to 2nd Isaiah, what we have found is that the community that is writing this book or collecting these writings is the community that has now been removed and exiled into Babylonia. They are people who were conquered and taken away. They were taken out of Judah and out of Jerusalem. They were removed and taken to Babylonia. And during that time, they were constantly struggling with the fact that their identity was changing, that their circumstances had changed, and what they knew and loved and held dear and sacred has now been stripped away from them. And so this may sound very familiar to you, but what they were saying was, we just want it to go back to the way it was. When can we get back to normal again? When can we go back to where we came from? How can we replicate that again in our lives? And so they're praying to God. They're asking for intervention. They're saying, God, please redeem us. Forgive us for any wrongs that we have done. Help our captors to be overtaken by someone else so that we can be freed and go back home. And that's exactly what ends up happening. They're freed. They go back home, and then we get to the starting point where we get to the third part of Isaiah, Isaiah 3, and what do we find out there? They get back home and they say, well, shoot, this isn't exactly how I remembered it. Things aren't the same as they were. And so now there's a new kind of grief because things are different again. Because they wanted to go back and repeat what was, and they found out that they can't. They thought that the magic bullet was going to come, that they were going to turn the page on calendar, on the history, and all of a sudden, things were going to get right again. And so they begin to pray, and they begin to worship, and they begin to ask God for answers. And as they're doing this, three things, I believe, come to the surface in terms of what they discover. They find that, one, they had been looking for outside intervention when God had been reminding them all along, no, you don't need to look to your neighboring countries for this. You can find that here with me. And so before it was always, let's see what our neighboring country, the big, powerful, and elite superpower is doing, and maybe we can get on their good side, and maybe they can help us with our enemies. And God always discouraged that, but eventually they come around to thinking, okay, maybe we do have all we need here. The second thing that keeps coming up is that the people are reminded that one of their chief concerns and priorities should be, how are we caring for each other? How are we caring for our brothers and sisters in our midst? How are we taking the believers in our community of faith, and how are we supporting them? How are we finding our comfort in them? How are we challenging them but leaning on them? How are we taking on the role of a servant to help others around us so that we can build this together? And then the last part is, they hold tight to this promise of a coming Messiah. They believe that God has yet to send the one who will redeem the people once and for all. And so these themes keep emerging. And I believe that there is very much for us to glean from 3rd Isaiah in our present set of circumstances. Because as radically different as they are, there sure are a lot of overlapping themes, I think, in terms of what we are experiencing and what we see in their time. First of all, we need not look to somebody else to save us. We do not need the intervention of somebody else. We have what we have from God, and that will sustain us. So let's not lose the faith. Let's not get discouraged. Let's not write off this faith tradition that we are a part of because we suddenly have found that things have gotten difficult. Let's hold fast and keep the faith during this time. The second part about leaning on one another and coming to one another's aid and serving one another is absolutely vitally important. In fact, for months now, I've been wanting to make a 3-year emphasis here in the life of the church. In 2021, what I want us to focus on is how are we going to fulfill our mission of strengthening families and growing committed disciples. But how are we going to have a renewed sense of emphasis of doing that as a faith community, as a local church congregation? How are we going to care for one another, lift one another up, inspire, educate, equip, comfort, pray for, and serve one another? You know, I know that one of my great concerns is that there are people in this community of faith who are struggling, who are suffering, and who we don't know are going through these things. But the best way that we can respond to one another's needs is by checking in with one another, calling, visiting, writing notes, and by all means, praying for them. But we're going to have a renewed sense of emphasis this year on how are we caring for one another as a church family. Then in 2022, what I want to do is talk about how do we expand that a little further out. How are we doing that same kind of thing, but instead of just within our local church, how are we doing that within our broader community? How are we doing that within our adjoining neighborhoods, within our zip code, and even within our city and metropolitan area? How are we going to emphasize that in 2022? And then, as you probably figured, in 2023, we're going to do it even bigger than that. So how are we thinking about what is our mark that we are leaving on our nation and on this world? And how are the people at Grace doing things that are an essential service to our global community, to our nation, and living out what it means to be a servant, leader, and a disciple of Jesus Christ on a global scale. So those are the things that we're going to be thinking about, but it starts this year with thinking about, much like it did in 3rd Isaiah, how are we caring for one another? How are we, during this very difficult and challenging time, supporting one another? And finally, the promise of the coming Messiah. Well, here's the good news. It's already happened. The people in Isaiah's time were living with this expectations, but for us, we live with the confidence and the joy and the new hope that comes with knowing that Jesus was already born. He has already come. Emmanuel has come to live and dwell among us, and we can follow in his lead. He has taught us how we might live. He has taught us how we care for one another. He has taught us about what our priorities and concerns should be. He has taught us about how to care for those who are in need. And he has shown us the way, the truth, and the life. The good news, the best news of all, the reason that we can say that life is truly good is not only because of all of these advancements that we have on the global scale, but because we can say on a universal scale that Jesus Christ has come to show us the way, that he has given his very life for us that we might live. Rejoice, church, because the light has come. There is joy in that, and there is certainly hope in that. There is hope. Life is ultimately good. In fact, it's not just actually good, it's incredibly good because we can rest with all else going on, knowing that our God is in control and that Christ has empowered us to live as his people, to live as his disciples, to live as those who have dedicated their life to him so that others might see that light within us as well. I look forward to talking to you over the next few weeks more about what our role is in that, what we can do to employ the best practices around us to help make our lives stronger and more joy-filled, to give others hope as well. I want to talk more about service. I want to talk more about our attitudes. But most of all, I want to bring home this point, that there is much to celebrate. There is much to give thanks for. There is a great deal to be joyful over. And most of all, there is hope because Christ has already come.